Bienvenidos al podcast del Instituto Fe y Libertad. En este espacio conversamos con expertos y analizamos posturas sobre economía, religión, libertad y más.
Welcome to this new episode of the Fe y Libertad podcast. My name is Carroll Rios de Rodríguez and I'm president here at Instituto Fe y Libertad. Today we are honored to have as guests Stanley Stillman and Leland Stillman, father and son. And we are going to talk about excellent health and education. We're going to try to talk about your professions and how they relate to the work we do here at Instituto Fe y Libertad. So we'll see how that goes. So could you please share with the audience a little bit about yourselves? Let's start with Dr. Stillman.
I'm a medical doctor, and for starters, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a medical doctor. I trained at the University of Virginia. In college, I had a special interest in environmental health, and now I practice natural, integrative, sometimes called functional medicine in the United States. And we have a long family history here in Guatemala, which is why we're here.
Okay. How about you?
Well, I think of myself as a journalist and have founded a online news digest for the trustees of higher education. Previously, early in my career, I was a correspondent for Time magazine and a contributor to various publications over the years. And in this context, very interested in the relationship between faith and markets, and in this case, higher education.
Stanley, you founded Pandea Times is the name of
Pandea Times, that's the name of this quarterly.
Of your quarterly, and it's really interesting. Tell us why you are so passionate about education.
Well, at one point in my introduction of a paper that I wrote, it's now about 12 years ago, the idea of a university constituted. Idea of a University is the title of a book by John Henry Newman, and I then combined my interest, if you will, in higher education with my training as a lawyer, and then added the word constituted to the title of his book. In this context, I think of higher education institutions as being in the United States and in what other countries, all countries, in many ways, as the soul of the culture. We have religion, and that's a very significant aspect to education under the circumstances. And in this context, the institutions that have evolved in the United States anyway to educate its citizens are the state universities, about 1,200 four-year collegiate and university level institutions. Interestingly enough, in the United States, there are only 4 federal government institutions. Only 4. The service academies, West Point, Annapolis, and so forth. All the other institutions are either independent, some of the earliest ones, such as Harvard and Yale, William and Mary in Virginia, date back to the 17th century. And in the 19th century, established in the University of Virginia and in some other states as well at a very early time in the 1840s by the state governments. I believe that University of Michigan, for example, I think dates to 1846. University of Virginia dates to 1830s, also chartered, if you will, by the state government. And now, these days, the preponderance of the students attending such institutions are to these state institutions. And my concern is how they are constituted, how they are governed. What is the governance structure of those institutions? I can go on forever.
Well, I found this great quote by Aristotle on the pages of Pandea Times.
Yes.
And it says, "Excellence is never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution." Why have colleges and universities strayed from this ideal of excellence?
That's a good question, and I think that what is the excellence and what is the basis for excellence? And under the circumstances, there's arguably two strands to education. And one is the more philosophical side of education, and the other is the more practical side, which is to say what you learn in higher education to pursue some kind of a job. And then on the other side are the more philosophical subjects, if you will, of one's citizenship and one's view of life. What is the basis for the role of a Homo sapien on the planet? Well, under the circumstances, there are a lot of people, students and parents, are very much end up being concerned about how their parents, about their children, and the children themselves in this context become more and more concerned about jobs and training to find a place in the market. And so there's obviously excellence in that. But the excellence, if you will, that's been in decline, if you will, is the preparation of a student for the bigger issue of their citizenship in the community in which they live and their meaning in life. And it gets neglected in the pursuit of mammon. I suppose is a way to say it. And you may have, then you have to ask yourself, well, you know, humans have over the eons, millennia, have in some ways gone into two ways, or the societies and the cultures have had their evolved one way or another. And we are at that stage now where the prosperity, if you will, it ends up, how should we say it, everybody is so prosperous that they forget why, the basis for that prosperity. I think that's an answer.
I think that's that gives us
this is
food
a
for
very
thought.
this is why did this happen? And you have to understand in this context, these issues, if you will, and the nature of man have existed for millennia, and we have cycles, shall we say?
We need to go back to study Aristotle, and get some philosophy and some theology maybe back into the curriculum. But Dr. Stillman, you also deal with excellence, and especially in the way that you practice integrative medicine. I think that has to do with excellence. Can you explain what that is and why it allows your patients to reach a good condition or a good level
health.
of health? Yeah.
So I don't know why, but I've always wanted to be the most effective at helping people to become and remain healthy. I was never interested in surgery. In fact, the surgeons hated having me on their teams in the wards because I was not interested and they could tell. But I don't know why I was fascinated by that. And the quote that best explains what I'm trying to do in taking care of patients comes from Hippocrates. And I was sort of shocked to find this quote after I'd graduated from medical school. I'd been practicing for 5, 6, maybe even 7 years. He said, the greatest medicine of all is teaching people how not to need it. And of course, what he means by that is that you're supposed to educate your patient in how they're supposed to live well so they don't need to take medicine. And that is really at the heart of what I do. And I think that's what physicians should aspire to. Not to say that there is not a place for surgery, there's not a place for drugs, there are, but their goal should be to rehabilitate the patient to a place where they're able to then get back to life in a way that keeps them healthy rather than landing them back in the surgeon's office or the subspecialist's office.
What modern tools are available to you that maybe weren't available to doctors in the past? And why is the holistic approach more effective than alternative approaches?
Tools that we have available that are very helpful are modern lab tests, as well as simple measurement devices such as blood pressure cuffs, pulse oximeters, anything that measures a vital sign, or we use a lot of fitness trackers and wearables actually in my practice. We get patients to buy things like Oura rings or Fitbits. We like the Oura ring for reasons that I talk about on my blog. But we'll use that data to help people understand their health. And where I became very interested actually in the intersection between what I do, medicine and faith, and in medical schools and in medicine in general, faith has really I wouldn't say left, it's been exiled from the building. The doctors I know who had faith were often in the furthest reaches of medicine, out in rural country hospitals. At major hospitals, there's no room for religious liberty anymore. But as I continued to practice and continued to study, what I found was that faith was not only integral to healing. If you really wanted to understand what was going to be good for the patient, you really had to begin from asking what was going to be, good, and it is an interesting word to use because we don't actually do things because they're good for our physical body. We do them because they're good for us in a sense of our spiritual and emotional well-being. And so that's really what I'm striving for and seeking for. And what I found with labs and advanced testing and techniques was that the way I would use them would be to demonstrate to the patient. It informed me medically to understand, okay, what is this person likely doing wrong in their day-to-day life? But then I was able to use that to take it to the patient and say, this is the evidence of what you're doing that's bad for you and wrong. Here is how we can get you back to good health by correcting your diet and your lifestyles using any number of different therapeutic approaches.
You sort of anticipated my next question, which was related to Instituto Fe y Libertad, and how we really explore sort of the boundaries or the interconnections between freedom and faith. And it seems to me that there's great enmity now between science and faith, or there's a sort of sense that you, when you follow the science, you are not giving into faith, maybe understood as superstition.
Right. I think that science is very interesting in that it was in so many ways actually pioneered by men of great faith. People forget that Isaac Newton was a devout Christian, inventor of modern, or of Newtonian physics anyway. He was in many ways the person who, he in many ways defined what it meant to be a scientist. He said, if nothing else, the thumb alone could convince me of God's existence. And he had many other wonderful quotes about faith. But I think that, if I were to stand in the devil's shoes in the 1800s and 1900s and say, how can I convince everyone that's what is bad for them is good for them, what institutions would I co-opt? And I would have picked science. And I think that's exactly what's happened. Because the reality is that at some point in history, moral authority in society has passed from priests, pastors, people of faith, who are focused specifically on morality as it maintains society and glorifies God and supports human health and well-being, to a very different group of authorities, medical and scientific authorities, whose priorities are not informed by a biblical worldview and whose ideas about what are good are sometimes very disturbing in their implications, which then of course gave rise to movements like the eugenics movement, people who now want to create or cause depopulation, people who want to control the food we eat, where we live, how we live, what we say, the whole vast apparatus of control that's being created for us by, organizations like the World Economic Forum and other people who have no grounding in faith and Christianity.
I think we see the same tendency, at least in U.S. campuses, where the freedom of speech has been greatly diminished, I think, with wokeness, and there's also, I think, a repression of religion in many U.S. campuses. Is that something that is actually happening, or is it something that we perceive it from Latin America?
Well, I certainly perceive it in the American institutions. One of the perceptions that I've developed is the scholasticism that now, what I refer to as scholasticism in education and the culture. And what do I mean by that? If you can't reproduce it, you can't prove, if you will, a result, it isn't true. But there are aspects to life where you cannot, the data doesn't prove, if you will. And so there's a lot of science, if you will, where you have to reproduce exactly what and as a consequence, if you can't reproduce it, it isn't true. Well, that isn't true, shall we say. There are aspects. So this is one of the ways in which science now, so many people in the sciences are, and I see this in medicine, and as it applies to me, for example. In my particular case, there is a story about the changes in my health as a consequence, and I am now working with a doctor, if you will, who isn't interested in the changes in my health practices, if you will, that is very clear to me and very clear to her, because there's no way for her to prove it. So I see this replicated all across, particularly in the social sciences. The trouble with the social sciences is that you have to make assumptions to begin with. And in economics, for example, those assumptions are homo economicus. Well, and there are a particular reactions people will have, but in actual life, people will make decisions that aren't necessarily related to their economic health. And under the circumstances, the equations that economists use, if you will, don't work. And so for my own, and some of the subject fields in which I'm interested, monetary policy, for example, and I think it's replicated all across the particularly the social sciences. And therefore, I put a lot of faith in humanities, if you will. The big problem with the humanities now is the data-centric approach that English professors are taking, for example, to how many words are repeated. And then they'll do a data analysis of the document and then so on and so on. And it's fascinating stuff, but it doesn't get into the deeper truths of Homo sapien experience on the planet. Because it doesn't lend itself to data. And enough said. Well, that's certainly why. And it's one of the reasons why higher education in the United States is, because it's drifted so far in the direction of the so-called sciences, even the application of science to something as noble as English literature or Spanish literature. I mean, any literature.
So we need to get back to the idea that you can find truth without necessarily having to use the scientific method and have physical proof of the truth, which is something that we struggle with here at Instituto Fe y Libertad. And I think hearing both of you, another conclusion I would reach is that liberty or freedom is essential both to the sound development of economics or journalism or universities as to medicine, right? That you need sort of to have freedom in order to develop good practices. So I think my next question, maybe the final question, would be, what advice would you give our audience on how to protect freedom and faith in their respective workplaces and in your professions? Maybe we can start with you.
My advice would be to be bold. I think the first thing that happens when liberty is about to be taken away is that the people who care about it get really quiet. And that's when they fail. That is the beginning of the failure. When I was counseling patients about the vaccine mandates in the United States, they would ask me, what should I do? I'm afraid. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to come out as someone who's against the vaccine, or at least skeptical of it for my own purposes. I just said, look, have a dialogue with your colleagues. We don't have, part of the reason I'm convinced they want us to be very virtual as a society is so that people can't gather around the water cooler and exchange notes in a candid way. They can put their thumb on the scales of a social media algorithm to make sure that people don't hear what they don't want them to hear. They can't do that at the water cooler. And I would say that, I don't know if you have water coolers here in Guatemala that people go to
but
and gather
we understand,
around. Yeah,
yes.
right. Hopefully it comes through from the English. But the idea was, look, find out who your friends are and just do it by asking questions. I can't remember if it was Socrates or Aristotle who said, I cannot convince anyone of anything, I can only make them think. And so I would ask people, well, how do you feel about the vaccine? And the thing I've found counseling patients is they'll admit almost anything to you if they're convinced that you're not going to make them feel ashamed or guilty or in any other way badly for feeling or thinking what they're thinking and feeling. And the people who think, oh, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, we have to all have at least half a dozen of them each, those people are going to tell you right away. So that they're not someone who maybe, and you may decide to take it upon yourself to ask those people questions. Well, why do you think we all need 6 boosters? Or do you really believe the pandemic has gone on for 2 or 3 years? And has it really been worth the economic, social, and so on costs of all the tyranny we've put up with, right? Which of course it hasn't been. But by asking those questions, you figure out who your friends are and who your enemies are. And then when you have your friends, you can band together and you can say, look, 10% of us don't want to take the vaccine. We're all willing to walk if you force us. So that is the only way to really push back in the very specific context of vaccine mandates, which was such a hot issue for us in the United States. And it was very hard to watch patients struggle with this conflict between, am I going to keep my livelihood or am I going to stick to my beliefs? But the first thing they did was they tried to get people afraid to express their views, and they then convinced them that they couldn't talk to anyone and they were totally alone. And that was how they got people, and that was how they coerced people subtly and very manipulatively into taking the vaccine if they didn't want it. And that's the first thing that happens. They try to make you be quiet.
That's really good advice.
Thanks.
How about you?
Well, I think that Leland puts it very, very well. My own gloss is to talk about freedom of speech. And I think in the context of the particular issues of the pandemic and so on and so forth, where very distinguished epidemiologists, one at Harvard and one at Stanford, who were taking into account, if you will, much more than just the science of how disease spreads. And instead of the shutdown that was dictated by somebody, and that's the right word, dictated by somebody who looked at the issue from the point of view only of the science, very distinguished science in this context, Fauci of the CDC and his advice. But he did not understand the social. And in this context, I would suggest that there were other epidemiologists of equal distinction in the private sector, if you will, who were ready to contradict him. And in this context, our media ended up following the dictates of Fauci, if you will, as opposed to giving any credence, any exposure to the ideas and analysis of these other esteemed, equally esteemed epidemiologists. So that's my gloss on top of Leland's from a point of view of a doctor. I'm looking at it from the point of view of the culture and how the political bureaucracies operate, and then how the society ends up getting informed by the media, and for that matter, a very, very wide range of people in medicine and medical schools under the circumstances. Even to this day, when you go into a university medical school for tests and so on and so forth, you don't have to wear a mask anymore. But even in those precincts, if you will, they were accepting the dictate of Fauci instead of the opinions of the equally esteemed and professionally qualified epidemiologists.
I think a lot of time was lost by not having a public debate about different viewpoints, so that we could have reached better conclusions or better ways of
not only a
handling
public debate, Carol, but understanding that a politician, if you will, its role in this is to understand and appreciate all the different ways that a particular policy is pursued, instead of following exactly what is the dictates, if you will, of the CDC in this case, and the World Health Organization. Same thing. And so, unfortunately, the politicians in this case were, initially anyway, Trump was one of the first. Trump's virtue is that he also publicized some of the remedies that worked in terms of taming the inflammation, if you will, the overreaction of the immune system to this particular virus. It's a very virulent virus, but people were dying from it because of their immune system overreacting to it. And there were medications that dealt with that issue, and they were squeezed out of any discussion. Please.
Well, I guess.
And now we're not talking about higher education. Well, we are talking about higher education.
We're talking about how policies also affect the environment of freedom in different professional realms.
Yes,
so
indeed.
I think this is very important. Well, thank you so much, Stanley and Leland, for joining us on this episode. For more information regarding Instituto Fe y Libertad, its works, activities, and what we discussed on this issue, you can visit feylibertad.org or our sites on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us until
Very
next
well.
time. And
Thank you,
for
Carol.
visiting Guatemala.
Bueno,
It's been great to
entonces.
see you. Yes.
Por seguro.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.